Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. So my name's Ryan Abernathy. I'm a physical oceanographer. And I'm going to present an example from our research that is part of my work for the SWAT science team. Who here has heard of this NASA SWAT mission? Just so I can read it. So it's a new ocean altimeter and land and river hydrology instrument. That's being launched in 2021. And so the idea with my talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about this science problem and some machine learning work we're doing. It's quite different from the sort of imagery classification type examples and a lot closer to what Pierre Gentin talked about this morning. And I'm going to sort of mix this in with some comments about the infrastructure that we think is right for doing this type of research. And so this is within the context of this broader Pangeo project, which has come up several times. And later in the session, my colleague Joe Hammon is going to give a lot more technical detail and description about what Pangeo is and how it works. So overall, I would say like what's happening in a lot of remote sensing fields is there's something there's what we can observe, and then there's what we actually want to know. And we need a model to translate between them. And for a long time, those models have been sort of deterministic physical models, and now we're moving towards more data-driven models and trying to combine the best of both worlds. So the example I want to talk about is ocean surface currents. So here's just an animation of like the speed of ocean currents as sensed from space. And you can see this is a fascinating and complex field. We see all kinds of eddies and fronts and variability. So this is what my science is all about, studying this type of circulation. Some impacts of ocean surface currents. Well, knowing about these currents is very useful for things like understanding where pollutants are going to go. So like when Deepwater Horizon oil spill occurred, knowledge about these currents allows us to forecast and understand where the oil is being dispersed. And they're also really central to theoretical studies about ocean circulation. For example, I've shown a figure where we assess turbulent energy cascades from showing how energy is flowing between different scales. And this type of work is very important for, say, improving climate models and deepening our understanding of the Earth system. Okay, so now for the physics part. So put on your differential equations hat. So the model that we have for these ocean currents derives from the momentum balance, a certain approximation of the Navier-Stokes equations that govern fluid dynamics. And this is the momentum equation that includes terms like acceleration, Coriolis force, and then some terms on the right-hand side, like a pressure gradient and a frictional stress term that's. And the key is that both things on the right-hand side of this equation can be measured from space in one way or another. If we make certain approximations, such as we're in a low Rossby number regime, so we're at large space and time scales, we can neglect some terms from this equation and arrive at a sort of deterministic diagnostic balance that relates do I have a mouse here? Is there a pointer here? That relates the Coriolis force on the surface on the current. So U would be the ocean current vector in 2 dimensions to these various pressure gradient and frictional terms. So this is, if you ever took a geophysical fluid dynamics class, you would have learned about geostrophic flow and Ekman flow. These are the foundation of the deterministic physical algorithms that we use to estimate surface currents. Now, altimetry, measuring the height of the ocean surface from space, gives us a way to estimate that pressure gradient. So it's a key component in this process. And so what we're looking at here is a very cool visualization about how our resolution of those altimeters has improved over time. So again, we're looking at ocean surface currents, and we see that as we upgrade and go to the latest generation of altimeters, so this is kind of our present generation, it's like we're taking the fog off of our glasses and we're seeing more and more detail about these currents. The SWAT mission that I'm part of is going to be launching a satellite that's going to go even beyond. So now we're going to see a simulation about what we might expect to see, and it's going to get even sharper. So while it's great to have this new data, Also, the fundamental assumption that governs our deterministic physical model, namely that we're dealing with large space and time scales, is breaking down because we're getting a higher resolution instrument that's measuring much finer scales. So the physics we've relied on for decades might not be the right model anymore. So, how can we use the data to derive a new relationship and that's appropriate to the new data? So what we're doing is something not nearly that ambitious. I want to describe a project I worked on with a PhD student, Anirban Sinha, where we just try and learn the existing physical model that we already think is good from data. And this was a very useful exercise, and anyone who wants to sort of spin up on machine learning, I recommend doing something like this. Try to learn something you already know, learn something you think you understand. And so that's what we did. We said, what does it need? What do we need to do to essentially learn this model that we think is good at certain space and time scales? And so we're using an approach that we call local stencil machine learning, right? And so it's kind of like convolutional neural networks in the sense we're considering a sort of neighborhood of points around some central point. But rather than trying to estimate some global feature, say, is there a cat in an image, we just want to estimate one quantity from this whole stencil. We want to estimate the surface currents given some footprint. And in numerical modeling, we would call this a stencil. So in order to evaluate that physics-based model that I told you about, what we would need is sea surface height, wind stress, some information about position, and maybe throw in sea surface temperature. We put those through a model, and those spit out a velocity vector. And that could be a deterministic model, or it could be a data-driven model. I'll skip that detail. If we have some true data to compare this with, we can define a cost function that we can try to minimize. And that's the basis for any sort of data-driven approach. To test out this idea that we can learn this relationship, we actually are going to simulation data. Because simulation data have a lot of advantage for this type of problem. There's no sampling errors or biases. We can focus on the sort of key physics and scientific questions. And we have full access to sort of the truth. And potentially we can also use transfer learning to move what we've learned from models to real observations. So we're working with a 1/10 of a degree ocean model simulation, about 100 years of daily data, about 10 terabytes of data. So I'll just quickly show you some results from this. The simplest type of data-driven model you can make, of course, is a linear regression, and that's what we started with. And here's sort of the true current, and here's what the best our linear regression model could do. And we learned some interesting things from this, like, as you expect, we couldn't learn a nonlinear relationship with the linear model. We could only learn the linearization of the equations, which, if you're familiar with geophysical fluid dynamics, amounts to sort of an F-plane approximation. So we couldn't learn a single model that was valid for the whole globe. We could only learn a model that worked for small regions. Moving to a more complex model, a deep neural network, we know that these are very good sort of general nonlinear functional estimators. And we found with this type of model, with those features, we could do just as good as our deterministic physical model and learn with the exact same skill predict occurrence with the exact same skill. It also had the same limitations as our physical model because we gave it the same features that the physical model knew about. So the next step with this research is to go beyond that deterministic model and figure out what other features, what other information we can use to actually get higher accuracy than what our existing physical model could do. I won't run through the table of the different results that we found, but the bottom line is with this approach, we can learn a model that's just as good as the physics-based one, and hopefully soon one that's better. The future challenge for this work that I want to sort of conclude with and motivate some discussion is that now you're probably all asking, well, that's nice in model land. How are you going to bring this research to real data? Problem is that our validation data in the real world are not neat, clean images. They are swaths of altimeters, nadir altimeters cutting lines across the globe, and our current measurements are from drifters that are highly unstructured in space and time. And so the idea that we have some nice, neat stencil, like we have in some image, some rectangular domain to learn data from is totally out the window. And instead, what we have are we have these highly unstructured, randomly spaced points. So this is actually a bit messed up. This slide needs to get out of the way. So the idea that we're playing with and don't have any results yet is that we can actually express a relationship between these unstructured points as a graph. We can create a triangulation between these points that encode the same sort of spatial relationships, allow us to understand gradients. And then we can use, now I'll bring in this little panel here that was supposed to pop up. We can use a really exciting field of deep learning based on graph neural networks to sort of reproduce these sort of convolution-based approaches in unstructured geometry. So that's ongoing research. Okay, how did we do this research? This was all conducted in the cloud. We produce analysis-ready data from this ocean model. We stored it in the ZAR format, and we uploaded that to Google Cloud. And we use the Pangeo platform to provide an analysis environment where we can sort of right away work with the data, don't spend any time sort of munging the data, scalably visualize and analyze the data, and try out a lot of different models. And really the way we, in this environment, the way we can share things with collaborators and distribute our code and all that stuff, just put things on GitHub and stuff can just work. It can interoperate because the data is accessible in a sort of global namespace via cloud storage. And Joe's going to talk a lot more about this architecture. So just a few take-home points. So I really think simulation data needs to be a part of this conversation, right? So simulations are a really important way we understand the Earth system, and especially when we think about going forward in climate change, it's really the only information we have about the future is from simulations. In this type of work, data preparation and munging the data in and out of machine learning formats is still kind of the most time-consuming part of this workflow, and the machine learning part is, once you have the data all ready to go, it's pretty quick and easy and fun. So we think this cloud-based sort of analysis-ready data has a lot of potential, not just for imagery, but for all types of scientific data. And I'm really interested to talk to people who've been thinking about unstructured data and how we build machine learning tools around data that are not image-like. Okay, thanks a lot.
Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. So my name is Joe Hammon. I'm a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where I kind of work at this intersection between data science techniques, software engineering, and climate modeling and hydrologic modeling. Ryan gave a great introduction to the Pangeo project, which I'm going to dive into, but I helped lead that project. And I kind of got into this space by developing a lot of the open source tools that I'm going to talk about today as kind of a side thing during my graduate school years. So start by telling you about the talk I'm not giving today, because I do some machine learning work, but largely I'm going to talk about infrastructure and what we're working on in the Pangeo project. But the talk I'm not giving today is about using transfer learning and hydrologic modeling, where we're kind of combining data from a bunch of different sources and scales. And so a project I've been working on recently has been combining in situ observations like FluxNet and SNOWTEL with global remote sensing measurements like GPM and like MODIS, LAI products. And we've been using LSTMs, or recurrent neural networks, to predict stream flow with those. And this is just an example of a flood in the corner. But the idea is there's been some early work done in hydrologic modeling that's showing that LSTMs are actually outperforming process-based models. And so for things like flood prediction, this is a really exciting area of research right now. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the kind of tool space that Pangeo provides. And I want to start with this, conceptual idea that the foundations of machine learning applications really fall into three categories. Of course, we have the tools. These are our software and our compute infrastructure. There's the data. So this comes from both observations and models. And then there's the analysis process that the scientist is involved with most directly, where there's some interplay between synthesis and theory, and that the the foundations for machine learning really include all of these things. So we've seen renditions of this slide on a handful of talks previously, but this is the growth of NASA data. And scientists are always saying we need more data, we need more data. And this graph kind of shows that to some extent we're getting it. So this is 250 petabytes on the y-axis there. This is the NASA Cloud Archive projection through 2025. And I'll just postulate that the presence of this data, while it may be transformative in our science capabilities, it's almost certain to break our existing data systems. And this diagram I have here is basically showing that you have some data provider and you have some API to download that data to your local computer, and we just can't do that anymore. This problem by itself has motivated a lot of the work we've done. So we need a new class of data systems. This is, and I'm gonna highlight mostly kind of cloud native data systems, although I don't have to be, we don't have to oversubscribe to that idea. HPC systems can operate a lot like the cloud if they change their ways a little bit. So what we really need is systems that are powerful, that are up to the task of handling petabyte scale data sets, that are flexible, that can handle a variety of scientific data applications, that are interactive, that allow us to interrogate data in a variety of forms at interactive timescales, seconds to minutes, not hours to days, that are cost effective and allow us to place the costs squarely or fairly across the data system, and then of course sustainable. So the architecture that we have been showing, and Ryan had this same slide in his last talk, is this, where you have some large compute systems. So I have cloud or HPC here in this box. It has access to distributed storage. That might be object store like S3 or GCS, or it might be a parallel file system on an HPC system. And the data on that system is analysis ready. It's ready for the scientist to use. We then have a system of open source software, like I'm highlighting here X-Ray and Dask, which are two Python applications that can efficiently operate on this distributed compute system. And the way the scientist accesses this is through some very thin client interface. So for our project, we largely use Jupyter Notebooks through a web browser, and we access very large compute systems on the backside just through our browser. This is different than SSHing into a terminal and moving files around. It's fundamentally a different way of thinking about the access point to these compute systems. So on the software side, we've been pushing towards really advancing the concept of this integrated scientific software ecosystem that Python exemplifies. And we've really focused on, again, integrating X-Ray, Jupyter, Dask, Pandas, and then a really wide swath of domain science applications, including things like deep learning libraries, like scikit-learn and TensorFlow. So I've said a lot about what's on this slide. This is repeating some of those things, but we're really, I think, pushing the limits or rethinking the way the scientist interacts with the cloud. So again, this thin client interface, rather than thinking about writing Lambda functions or spinning up virtual machines, you access this just through your web browser, and that infrastructure is provisioned on the backside. We provide high-level abstractions for things like parallel computing. So Kubernetes is a container orchestration system. Dask is a parallel computing library in Python. Those are interfaced through a really high-level client-side library called Dask Kubernetes. Provide highly configurable environments, and to the point where a single click from a GitHub repository can launch you into a Docker image that's running on the cloud and gives you access to hundreds or thousands of compute instances. I mentioned analysis ready data. So this is the basics of analysis ready data are that this scientific and geographic pre-processing is done on the front end. And that these data sets are often provided in some cloud optimized data format so that the data can be accessed through more efficient mechanisms. There's a notion, and Chris Holmes from Planet has written about this a fair bit in a series of blog posts that I've linked to here, about analysis-ready on-demand data, where the analysis-ready data set is actually created on the fly, which is, I think, for large data archives that have potentially many iterations of analysis-ready data, something that's really interesting. Of course, there's trade-offs to on-the-fly or on-demand analysis-ready data, repeated compute versus persistent storage. But something that I find to be really intriguing is the ability to hack or to modify the configuration or the recipe that leads to analysis-ready data. And so if on-demand analysis-ready data systems exist, I can modify those and create a new level 3 or level 4 data set that fits my data processing pipeline needs. Of course, these are really important inputs to our machine learning applications. Something I haven't mentioned yet is this notional idea of high-level data brokers. So on the top of this slide, I have a YAML file that describes a partial recipe. I'm not showing all of this recipe, but a partial recipe for accessing a cloud data set that a scientist may want to interact with. And this tells you about where the URL is and what type of data set or data file format it is, and what are those arguments that it would be needed to open this. And then in a Jupyter notebook, this catalog that I was showing you is just referenced once, and then that data set is accessed by its name. This is really important for really complex data sets that need to be constructed on the fly, or where the pattern for opening and constructing that data set is maybe hard to reproduce. This gives us some sort of framework for providing this on-demand analysis-ready data and distributing that recipe. So here I'm showing just an example from this Python package called intake. There are other ways you could do this, but I think intake is probably the furthest along, and something we found to be really useful. We've been producing climate model data similar to what Ryan was using for his science use case. That is analysis ready and stored on the cloud in cloud optimized format. We have two recent cloud public data set program data sets. So we have CMIP6, about that data set, its total archive will be about 200 terabytes, or sorry, 20 petabytes. But we're currently around 200 terabytes, I think. The community or system model large ensemble, it's a 100-member climate ensemble. It also exists on AWS in the public data set program. And these are, I think, good demonstrations for how climate model data can be accessed and used in a cloud native setting. Okay, so in conclusion, I have talked about kind of some of what I think are the key infrastructure components for machine learning platforms in the earth sciences. Those fall into user-friendly cloud native compute environments, cloud optimized data formats, on-demand analysis-ready data, and high-level data brokers. And then what I didn't spend a lot of time talking about is this integrated software ecosystem where we can use high-level data models, analysis tools, and machine learning libraries to kind of create this life cycle, a research cycle of machine learning. And that's kind of where we're spending a lot of time right now, is really focusing on these interactions between those analysis libraries. And that's all. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Swatantran. I don't have my name up there, and I just sent the presentation. I didn't even realize I didn't have my name, but my name is Anu, and don't worry about the last name. It means independent though, and it's a really nice name. So I really enjoyed today's session. There was such a lot to learn, so many new ideas and new machine learning algorithms, new open access data sets and platforms. It's really invigorating. I really enjoyed today's session. And I kind of go back a little to history. It makes me think where we came from, or where I came from. And just to give you some information on that, But 70 years back, when I was not around, my my grandfather Raghu was a farmer in India, and he kept very good records of the soil, of the temperature, precipitation, weather. He knew what seeds to plant where. He knew how his yields were going in that season, when to harvest, and how to manage the harvest, send it to markets, get machinery from abroad, and things like that. Really bring together people as well, form the community. And he did all this without any machine learning algorithms. He had it in his head. So he was a data scientist in his own right. And then fast forward 70 years from then, I was a grad student at the University of Maryland, College Park, and I remember using the Averis hyperspectral imagery. It was like a 30 gigabytes per file, 300 gigabytes of data, and there was no way to process it because my computer couldn't handle it. There was no RAM, no GPU, no computing. It was a nightmare. And to add to that, we had LiDAR, point clouds, and waveforms, millions and millions of data points. So how we really started off there, processing that, making sense of it, to where we are today. Within a short span of about a decade, I think we've made tremendous accomplishments as a community. And then, so I was involved in a lot of research in satellite remote sensing at the University of Maryland, and defining science requirements for satellite missions like JEDI, the laser, the airborne, the laser mission that went on to this International Space Station. But then I found at some point we needed to make the connection with people. We developed really good products. We developed we have cutting edge technologies, but people on the ground really either don't want it or don't need it, or they don't know that they need it. So that's when I made this shift, and I took up a job at this company called, it was actually DuPont Pioneer at that time. It's a seed company. They sold seeds, and they sold crop chemistry to farmers and helped them manage their fields. They did really good. And then they realized they need digital. Everybody is doing ag tech, and they have to do it. And their condition was very much like your talk. I didn't get your name, sorry. The talk that you had, how you dealt with satellite imagery when you first started using it. And that's the condition, that's what they faced when they started off. This was before I joined Corteva. And they struggled with it. They really tried to get on, and they did. Credit goes to them for doing a whole lot of heavy lifting. And then I come in, but I have a lot of background in this field, and I've done work here. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of people at NASA. So I'm really involved in making the connections between the public and private sector and taking it to the next level. Oh, how does this move ahead? Okay. Okay, so not a sales pitch, but who are we? We are Corteva Agri-science. It's a new agri company with a new mission and a new vision. The mission is to enrich the lives of those who produce and those who consume, and ensuring progress for generations to come. And that really means the center of everything we do is the customer, is the farmer, is our consumer, and we really want to develop products, solutions, algorithms, everything, keeping them in mind and starting with them. Okay, this, I guess you've probably already seen how agriculture has changed and how drastically the yields have increased over the years, and how farming has changed from subsistence farming long back to mechanized agriculture. And now it's environmentally sensitive, it's data driven, and it's geared towards holistic solutions. And data plays a very big role in this. So we have, Corteva has three portfolios. There are three areas that we really work in. One is creating seeds, and for good or bad, just innovating. There's a lot of science there in making seeds more drought resistant and making them pest tolerant and improving yields in across the globe, over 131 countries, and then providing the support along with it in terms of digital or crop protection. And each of these has machine learning built into it because there is data at every point. So be it fertilizer management, water management, forecasting, optimization, crop selection, yield prediction, disease prediction, disease identification, zone management, and so on. So there are a bunch of applications that we have in proximal sensing, in drones, satellites, and so on. I'll focus on the remote sensing data science for today. And the way we collaborate is it starts right from understanding the environment, whatever analytics we need, it starts right there, knowing the soil types, knowing productivity zones, and then getting estimates of when is a good time to plant, then monitoring the crop through the season, making in-season forecasts of yield, informing the grower as required, and monitoring canopy health continuously throughout the season. And then coming up with harvest recommendations. When is a good time to harvest? Can we predict that with machine learning models? And then providing post-season insights. At each and every step, you can see the data-driven models. And then there are also process-driven models, and we have the challenge of really integrating them, as we've already seen in today's talks. And multi-sensor integration is the key. We really need all different kinds of sensors. We use visible, near-infrared, planet data, publicly available, NASA satellites, Sentinel, and SAR. So a couple of applications, I'll very quickly run through them. One is plant count. When the plants, this really helps to know the seeding rate and how well the plants have started emerging. We use algorithms to detect and count the plants and then validate them based on how well we do. And now it's almost real time. We're able to do that with the drones. And then again, with the drones, we are able to get RGB images and process the point clouds and get the ground elevation and the canopy elevation, get to canopy height, which is again being deployed across the world. Then we get into advanced phenotyping. We're able to monitor canopy health throughout the season and have a bunch of traits that are monitored throughout. And then we have yield prediction. A lot of people have different kinds of yield models. It's all over the place. We have ours too. And the advantage that Corteva has here is that a lot of training data, which again is another whole can of worms because it's not easy to share that data set, but it allows us to create and refine our models and then compare our products with existing data sets out there. And we're able to do this at different resolutions. This is just a 250-meter data set that was done a couple of years back, actually. And now we have many more historical yield predictions. We have it at different resolutions, subfield scales. And then bringing all of this together, along with the daily weather data, planet data, and MODIS, we're able to really give actionable insights throughout the season and help the growers farm better, get better yields, get more value for what they do. And that's all I have here. I didn't go into very much detail. And we have Granular, which is also a part of Corteva. It's an independent subsidiary, and they do a lot of farm management, granular insights, the digital side of the business. I lead the R&D remote sensing research, and I work closely with the business partners to get solutions out there and also work in sustainability and smallholder farmers. Corteva has a lot of efforts, initiatives in this area. I'm happy to talk more later.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. I'm a PhD student at Stanford, advised by Professor David Lobel. I'm in the applied math department, but David is in earth science, so I'm using machine learning methods on earth science problems. Specifically, I'm going to talk about some of the work I've done this past year on crop type mapping in smallholder systems and how we're doing that with crowdsourced data. Oops. Okay. So we've seen versions of this already today, but if we think about what kind of models we want to build, these might be some of the criteria that we're looking for. So high performance, obviously, we want some degree of generalizability and robustness to a reasonable amount of noise. So what I'm gonna talk about today deals primarily with these first three. We saw that if a model gets garbage in, there'll be garbage out. But ideally, we also have a model that wouldn't totally break if there's some small amount of noise in the data. We've also seen versions of this, but just quickly, there's two common mismatches that I see in trying to do crop type maps. One is that high performing models need large amounts of data, and then EO data sets often are small, especially in these smallholder systems. And then secondly, we want models that can generalize across years. Like we don't want to have to like maybe do a new model every single year. And we also want to generalize across space. So if we train a model, say in Illinois, it'd be great if it could also do reasonably in Iowa. So supervised learning right now is highly specialized. And this example down here comes from like classic machine learning, where if you trained a classifier to classify dogs and cats, but then the dogs always happen to be outside, then if you show the classifier a picture of a dog indoors and cats were always indoors, it's not clear what the classifier is going to do. And not to say that that's like a wrong behavior, because these correlations might exist and be things that we should learn from, but we want to somehow disentangle what's causal from what's spurious. Okay, so in the smallholder farming domain, right now, most of our data comes from farm surveys, which are collected typically by governments or NGOs. And we have these like large, high quality surveys, but in developing countries, they're not conducted very often. So we might have this data for every 5 years and in very localized villages. Academics also sometimes go out and collect these surveys, but in those cases, the sample size tends to be small. So as a result of these limitations in farm survey availability, currently there's no global field scale crop type map. And you can probably imagine that having this sort of map would be helpful for downstream analyses like field scale yield prediction. So in order to overcome this data scarcity, I've put the potential solutions in a few different categories. One, we could invent models that need less data, so we can use smaller amounts of data but still do pretty well. So things like transfer learning, representation learning, unsupervised learning all fall in that category. We can also try to find alternate data sources, which is what I'll focus on today here with the crowdsourced labels. And we should invest in these traditional survey collection infrastructures in developing countries, because even if we do the first two well, we still need survey data to validate that what we've done is good. So now moving on to crowdsourced labels and how we can use them. As you can probably imagine, when you ask a bunch of people to submit data, you can get a lot of it, but then the quality of it is kind of unknown, or is probably going to be really noisy. So our study is focused on figuring out whether we can use these labels and how robust is our model to noise. So the data that we're working with comes from a really cool app called Plantix. So Plantix is made by this German startup called Pete. And in this app, it's a free Android app. A farmer can take a picture of their plant, and then the app will return to them what pest or disease is afflicting their plant. So for example, here someone took a picture of a leaf, and the app has diagnosed it with potassium deficiency. For our purposes of mapping crop types at the field level, this is convenient because smartphones today have GPS, And so the photo is geotagged. And then through the photo, we can also tell what crop type is in the photo. So now we have these geotagged crop type labels. And we're going to be doing this case study in India because 80% of Plantix's 1 million users are there. So the overall study objective here is to create a field scale crop type map, which is our prediction, with crowdsourced submissions from Plantix, which are our labels, and the features that we're using are multi-temporal satellite imagery, in this case, Sentinel-2. Now, if we take a look at the data, we can see this is in 2 states in Southeast India, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. You can immediately tell that Plantix submissions are huge in number and also very wide in spatial coverage. So here I'm showing the top 4 crops in this data set in these 2 regions. It's rice, cotton, pepper, and groundnut or peanut. And over the course of 2 years, from 2017 to 19, this app received 1.8 million submissions. So this sort of scale is not something that you can achieve by sending a team of people out to do surveys. And also, it's very widely distributed, and you would also have a hard time getting such a distribution if you just sent a team of people out. But as I mentioned, crowdsourced data is really noisy. So here I've just listed 4 main ways in which these submissions can be wrong. So first, location accuracy on the Android platform is not perfect. There's a trade-off between how much it drains your battery and how accurate your GPS is. So you can see this is a log axis on the x-axis. There's a huge peak around like 3,000 meters accuracy. And these fields are already smallholder fields, so they're only like 2-ish hectares or less. So 3,000 meters away is like something completely different. And then I won't talk about all of these, but for example, the second one is farmers also didn't always submit from inside of their field. And that's partly related to the fact of the GPS inaccuracy, but partly also because it's normal for people just to stand at the edge of their field if they're going to take a picture of it, not like step into their rice paddy. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we cleaned this one up. So for this not inside a field problem, we took very high resolution satellite imagery from Digital Globe. And at that resolution, humans can look at an image and tell whether it came from inside a field. So we had a couple graduate students, myself included, label 3,000 of these images with a sentinel footprint at the middle to say whether that sentinel pixel comes from inside of the crop field or not. And then we trained a ResNet 18 model to do this classification on the remainder of the like million images, and we got almost 90% accuracy. So that was good enough for us to move on. And then so we like threw out the ones that were not inside a field. It was also really important to do geographically representative resampling because we had a lot of super users, as you can see by these really like dark areas here. And these are people who would submit hundreds of submissions from like one field. So when we trained our first model, we realized that it was just doing really well in these clusters and then ignoring the rest of the states. And that's not good because what we want is a general model for this region. And so when we did the resampling, our training set looked more like the panel on the right. And then we also had spatially representative validation and test sets. After this cleaning, though, it's worth noting that our almost 2 million submissions became 10,000. So this really emphasizes how noisy crowdsourced data is, but it's still progress because this is more data than was previously available about smallholders in these states. So I won't go into the machine learning models, like their architectures, but we tried 3 different models with different features. So the one that worked the best was a 1D convolutional neural network over just a single pixel's worth of time series. And with that model, we got 74% accuracy classifying rice, cotton from everything else. And if you look at the broad spatial patterns of rice and cotton, rice is in dark blue and cotton's in lighter blue. It makes sense. There's a lot of cotton in the drier regions of Telangana, and there's more rice along the coast of Andhra Pradesh. And then if you zoom in, you can see rice along riverbanks, which we didn't have any labels in this region. It just figured out that rice is probably along rivers. I'm going to skip that, but I think important to note is that some small or moderate degree of noise in the label data set was okay. So we fed in expert labeled samples, of which we only had 800 in this case, and compared it to if we included all of these neural network labeled crop types, and that gave us 8,000. And you can see that whatever we might lose from the neural network not being as accurate as a human expert, we gain in the sheer data set size from having like 10 times more labels. So I think it's worth considering. Yes, it's important to have good quality training data, but if that means foregoing like a wide geographic distribution that you're able to sample and label, I think it's worth taking some amount of noise for just a broader distribution that you sample from. So in conclusion, this study shows that crowdsourcing can be a viable new source of data on smallholders, especially now as more and more people in rural areas have access to mobile internet. And there are some problems with this. For example, Plantix is a private company, so they rightly can't just share their users' data. So if we're gonna use crowdsourcing, we have to think about how can we protect user privacy, how can we clean this data, and how can we maybe increase the conversion factor from 1.8 million to 10,000 and have cleaner data as well. So thanks. I also, shameless plug for some of our other work more on the methodology side. I'm also interested in these topics, so would love to talk about them. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm going to be talking about some of the machine learning applications for agricultural monitoring. We've heard about this from some of the other speakers in this session, but I will try to build on that in this talk. So as Hammon mentioned, I'm at the University of Maryland, where we manage the NASA Harvest program, which is the NASA Applied Sciences program for agricultural monitoring and food security. And so I work on a lot of our machine learning projects within NASA Harvest. So why would we want to monitor agriculture using remote sensing data? One reason is that we want to estimate the crop production either regionally or nationally, both in our own country as well as other countries. And this plot here shows that the forecast errors for crop production is extremely high in the time leading up to harvest. And so this is where we can help resolve some of those errors using remote sensing. Another reason is that we want to be able to inform and stabilize markets, such as commodities markets, that are trading based on what we predict will be production for these different crops during the season. So this example shows the average price of corn in the US during this last highly variable growing season, where we see compared to other years, 2019 in red was quite variable. We also want to anticipate food crises and be able to allocate and deliver aid before it's needed. So here's just a quote from Martin Owar in the Office of the Prime Minister in Uganda, who noted that in 2017, this was the first time that they were able to proactively deliver aid to a region in Uganda that was suffering from a food shortage based on the information that they got from satellite data through the Crop Monitor program, along with NASA Harvest. So they saved almost $3 million and helped over 150,000 people. We're also using machine learning and agricultural monitoring to help companies determine their insurance payouts. Here's an example of when this is necessary, where we had these extremely flooded croplands in Iowa in this past growing season. And finally, we want to be able to monitor and meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and agriculture reaches almost all of these. either directly or indirectly. So Anu gave a good overview of research areas in machine learning for agriculture, particularly as it relates to the grower. And I think this is kind of a more macroscopic view of machine learning for agriculture, where we kind of break down into 3 sub-problems, which are crop classification, condition assessment, and yield estimation. And within crop classification, which is a huge area of research, and probably what the biggest application of machine learning in agriculture, we have many different sub-problems. For example, are we mapping individual crop types, or are we mapping cropland versus not cropland, as we saw earlier in Lyndon's talk? Are we wanting to classify these crops during the growing season or once the growing season has finished post-harvest? These are very different problems. Smallholders versus large-scale farms. Smallholder farms have much smaller field sizes. There might be multiple crops grown within one field, which is very different from these large-scale farms with enormous field sizes and single uniform crops. And then, of course, what resolution do we want to map these at? Creates a lot of different sub-problems within this area. And as Hammon mentioned earlier, not only are we interested in knowing what the crops are or what type they are, we also want to know things about the types of farming practices that are being used. This is especially important for sustainability. And so there are also efforts to map these different kinds of farming practices, such as crop rotations or irrigation type. Condition assessment is another major area where usually we're looking at condition as it relates to yield. For example, do we expect that this area or are the current conditions favorable or not favorable for a future harvest? Or we might be looking at it with respect to stress, where we might be looking at detecting diseases or other types of stress on the crops, such as water stress due to drought. And then finally, yield estimation, which Anu talked a lot about, is where we're trying to estimate how much production per area are we going to be getting from particular crops. And because crop classification really is the first step in yield estimation to determine where those crops are in the first place, a lot of these sub-problems kind of parallel those of crop classification. One different one being long-term versus short-term. So there's a lot of work in not just can we forecast the yields at the end of this season, but can we anticipate food shortages in future seasons, years from now, for example, when climate change is a factor. So another way to kind of categorize this within our machine learning taxonomy is that in crop classification and condition assessment, we're typically looking at classification methods. And so our outputs are discrete classes. And within these methods, the temporal, spectral, and spatial information are all extremely important. And which one is more important really depends on the individual problem. And again, in spatial, with the resolution that we mostly have available, we're usually looking at sort of texture rather than individual shapes of a crop, for example. Really common methods that are used for this in the literature are random forests and decision trees, and to some extent support vector machines. But increasingly, especially in the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot more deep learning, particularly convolutional networks and recurrent neural networks. On the other side, we're using regression. So in the case of yield estimation, we're looking at continuous outputs. And I grouped condition assessment in here because often when we're talking about condition with respect to yields, it might be just a discretization of the yield estimates. And so in yield estimation, these models are, yield itself is really influenced by a variety of biotic and abiotic factors. And generally, it's not really that well understood what exactly is influencing yield for different crops in different areas. So this is a place where machine learning is really playing a role. And common methods for this are, of course, linear regression methods, or regression trees are quite popular. As well as biophysical models or process-based models are commonly used. And of course, same as in crop classification or really any discipline today, we're increasingly seeing deep learning methods being used here. So the particular area of agricultural monitoring that I focus on is crop classification. So I'm just going to give some brief examples of this. So one example is from Matt Hansen's lab, the UMD GLAD lab, which Steve mentioned earlier, where they're looking at doing, in this particular example, soybean classification in Brazil. And so the method that they use for this is a decision tree, and they have defined dozens of parameters that are useful for separating different types of crops. And really this tree is the workhorse for almost all of their projects. And different features might be have different importance depending on the problem. Another example is some work that I've done at Harvest, where we're looking at predicting corn and soybean planting in the US during the season. And so in this, we basically look at, we capture specific phenological stages in the development, and then we use the spectral time series data as well as some spatial information in a CNN and combined LSTM network. And so you can just see some small results there that we found that there's been far more corn planted this year than in prior years, primarily due to the trade war and extreme weather. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these data sources because we've heard quite a bit about this already. And one I want to point out is that, you know, one way of getting around ground data scarcity is to use unsupervised classification. Another is to look at public-private partnerships, which is what we're doing at Harvest, to kind of leverage privately collected data to train our own research models, and also crowdsourcing methods like Sherrie presented in the last talk. So some challenges for agriculture is that we have really high interclass variability and really low interclass variability. So corn might look very different across the world, but corn and soybean might look very similar spectrally. We also have very noisy data and labels in many cases. We've heard a lot about interpretability today also. And of course that we have very sophisticated compute requirements for these types of data as well. We've also talked a lot about benchmarks, so I'm not going to spend time on that. I want to emphasize again that sharing data and code is extremely important. There's so much duplication of effort in the agricultural community, and people publish crop type masks without ever publishing the crop type mask, which is coming from computer vision is extremely frustrating, and I think would really help our community. And just briefly, I think in the community, there's maybe some effort to be spent on performance reporting, where I often see a lot of overlap or correlation between training and test data sets. So this is one example where a good example where the training and test sets are separated based on the parcel, not pixels, so that pixels cannot be within the same field. And also, I think propagating error from the training labels into your accuracy metrics is extremely important as well. There are errors associated with the CDL, the NLCD, with crowdsourced labels, and we don't consider that when we say this map is 95% accurate. So thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to discussions later.
Okay, everyone, there's only my talk between me and coffee break, so I'll try to make it as exciting as it can be, given that the caffeine blood level in blood is probably dropping down. So I've been coming here a long way from Austria, from International Institute for Applied System Analysis. I'm working in the Earth Observation Citizen Science group, given that most of our time we work with the data collection, crowdsourced citizen science, and plenty of time we also put into the mapping effort. When I just joined our group, my first task was mapping a couple of the cities, detailed urban topology, and 40% of my time I basically spent collecting training data. Then there was exciting 20% of the time where I played around with machine learning algorithms. I got really nice maps, and then I wanted to independently validate that. So I learned how to use Google Earth time series, collecting the data, putting them in Excel spreadsheets, super unofficial way, but it was years ago. once I get more integrated in the group, I learned about all the great tools that we had in our in-house group that we've been developing. And I learned about three main things. So complexity, not all data have the same level of complexity. Not all the data that you want to collect is the same difficult to interpret. So let's say managed forest and forest, it can be difficult to collect, but if you want, you ask if you see water or clouds on the image, there's some data that is easy to collect. Not for all the data you need to actually visit the field. You don't need to go in the field. Some of the data you can collect from the Earth observation, satellite images. And not all data that you want to collect, you need to collect yourself. So this leads me to the crowdsourcing and citizen science efforts, which we're mentioning at least 2 other presentations today. And today I'm going to show you 4 different tools, and not all the tools that we have developed at YASA, but this is 4 main tools that we are using for different data collection and validation efforts. And I'll split them into 2 different categories. It's crowd-driven tools and expert validation tools. For some of the tools, you just need your laptop. For some of the tools, you can send citizens on the ground and collect the data. What distinguishes these crowdsourcing methods from other apps that are collecting the data is that here you have more control on how you design your sample. Here you have more control to which locations you want to see to collect the data, either using satellite images or going on the ground and collecting the data. That means it saves you a lot of time cleaning up the data, what was mentioned with the previous speaker, and it gives you more flexibility of what you want actually to collect. So starting from the GeoWiki engagement platform, this is the crowdsourcing tool that gives you all the flexibility to decide what type of the information you want to collect. So as a background, you can use high resolution satellite background imagery, but you can also plug into Sentinel time series. You can see an DVI time series profile. You can fully customize what kind of questions you're asking for the particular location. You can also decide how many independent validations you want to get from different citizens or crowdsource. You can engage your expert validation, and you can incorporate the quality assurance method, meaning that whoever is contributing with the data, you would put once in a while some expert validations to control for the quality of the data. One of the examples of this kind of the data collected, we ran a couple of years ago this is not the most recent campaigns, but on the global crop run validation and global field size campaign, we had the 46,000 unique locations which were visited independently by 3 separate users. So we had around 80 volunteers and 144,000 validations for the first campaign, and 130 volunteers for 390,000 validations that we collected. Important to say, whenever you try to engage citizens on crowdsourcing, the task itself is also important. So it's not only like how much data we can collect. You either need to, like the citizens or like crowd, they either need to relate to why you are collecting the data, or you should put some incentives in there. So we had some incentives as the being co-author on their paper when we published this data, or winning some different prizes. So everyone has his own incentive to that. I will be showing another example of other app where we had a lot of users engaged without putting any incentive in that. So talking on the level of the complexity, that was very, those type of data that you collect can be very complex. You ask different questions, you ask users to measure the field, to know the area, to ask in terms of field size, what is the dominant field, what is the size of the field, what they actually see. But some of the tasks are very easy. So if you want to have simple cloud, no cloud, or forest, no forest, water, no water, for that you don't need some super complicated interface. So there was a lot of discussions with my colleagues recently, outsourcing and crowdsourcing. So basically crowdsourcing where a lot of people collect with the data for a little bit, and outsourcing when you have a group of experts sitting in the room, or like local experts, and they're contributing with the data. So you cannot have crowdsourcing, you cannot have millions of people or thousands of people contributing with the data if your task is too complicated, because they would try to engage, but you would lose a lot of people on the way, and your crowdsourcing task would become just an outsourcing task. So coming to the crowdsourcing idea, for the simple tasks where the level of complexity is not that difficult, we had the tool which called Picture Pile. So this is web mobile application designed for rapid image assessment or change detection. So it depends what you put into the app. It can be image before and after, and you ask if you see any change, if you see deforestation, if you see damaged buildings, or you can put any even photograph and you ask simple yes, no question. So in the crowdsourcing, it's called microtask. So you put something so easy and simple for a person to identify that you can collect a lot of data in a very short amount of time with the high accuracy. The example for this was we ran some pilot test project test, Hurricane Matthew post-disaster damage assessment, where we took the images before and after, and we asked simple question if you see damaged buildings on the figures. We didn't advertise this campaign at all, so it was just to test how fast to test the whole workflow, because for any post-disaster damage assessment, you need to do everything super quickly in a couple of hours, under 24 hours. So we were testing our capabilities to actually deal with this question. Surprisingly, with a little bit of announcement to our crowdsourcing, we got a lot of users contributing with their validation, spending a lot of time. So it means that the reason why you're collecting the data should be clearly communicated to the citizens crowdsourced, then you can engage them better, and you don't need to put much of the incentive if they know why they're doing that. Or in terms of the commercial apps, as it was shown, you give some information for the farmers to grow, and they contribute with their data to your campaign. So I will rush through two more examples. PhotoQuest Go, in the case where you really need to go on the ground, you don't need to send the expert traveling there, traveling back. You can have the local user go to the point that you're interested in and collect the data from that point. They can take the images, south, north, east, west, they can collect some questionnaire, and the experts sitting in their office can look through the 100 of different locations that the users are on the ground, and it would be much more efficient. The last, the last one is expert validation tool. This one is actually recommended by European Environmental Agency for validating Copernicus local component datasets. That's anyone who is creating the maps, they come to the point where you need to say some accuracy numbers, you need to validate. So this one is, app is create in order to facilitate the validation process, meaning you would upload your data set, generate sample, or upload your own sample, and then you would share that to your colleagues or wherever your community is there to help you to validate this data set. Then you get your accuracy numbers, and that hopefully would help you to speed up your validation process. So there's new features adding to the LACO-wiki. We are continuously developing with this. That's why we are very excited to be present at this workshop, because we'll be talking a lot about the training data, and some of the decisions that we take in developing our products is something what is driven by the community that needs this data. Also, we've been collecting a lot of data over the past many campaigns and seeing how can we integrate those outputs into the community to make the best effort and not to waste this effort overall. So that's it from my side. If you have any questions or you want to see closely about those tools and apps, how the things work, I will be more than glad to show you. And yeah, thanks for having me here.